Howdy, and welcome to the Pagan Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Janet Callahan. I'm the author of Parenting Pagan Tots and 2 workbooks on children's programming, one that is specifically about working with disabled and neurodivergent children in pagan programming. You can find those on Amazon and on Kindle. I also write the mother column for Sage Woman magazine, and I run a group that's pretty eclectic called Spiral Moon Family Circle. I'm also the mom to 2 children, currently 12 and 15, who are disabled. On this podcast, we talk about all things pagan parenting. So, on this episode, I want to talk about some things that have come up in the news and in the courts over the last couple of years, all of which relate to religion and schools. One of the places I want to start with is a Supreme Court decision that impacted schools in Maine. Maine had a really particularly interesting way of handling high schools. In rural areas where there weren't enough children to support a whole school on their own, school districts could either bus kids to some other county or other school district, or parents could get a voucher to pay for a private school that was local, of their choice, as long as that school was not religious. Now, I don't know who in their right mind would open a private school in a county or in an area where there were so few children that the school district couldn't support a high school. Private schools take a lot of money to run, and so usually they are looking for areas with more people, with wealthier people who can afford to pay tuition. At any rate, parents sued because obviously just because you can get a voucher to another school to use at another school doesn't mean there's another school to use it at. It also doesn't mean that there's another school that's close. A lot of Christian churches run schools in part because they want to give the children in their church that religious background in their education. Some are good, some are bad. Some public schools are good, some are bad. Same with charters, same with private schools. There is everything from super, super good to super, super bad. And just because a school is quote unquote good doesn't mean that it's good for every student. So parents basically said, you're discriminating against us for wanting to pick this religious school that's near us rather than, something that's an hour away. And the court agreed with them. I'm not sure they should have, but they did. Now, I live in Michigan, and in Michigan there's actually a constitutional amendment that says you cannot use public school money to fund a religious school. I think it's that you can't do it any private school. But in Maine, apparently, this was tied specifically to this law, not to anything larger than this. And so, basically, they ended up saying, yeah, a religious private school and a non-religious private school both follow the same rules, which is to say they don't follow the rules of a public school. And so choosing that one specific thing to be the reason you can't use a school with this voucher is a problem. Obviously, Maine could have gotten out of this by choosing any number of other ways to do it, right? You could create more public schools. You could fund better transportation. You could have had virtual schools. It was 2022 when this case went to court. And by then we'd already been doing virtual schools for a while. But even if you'd gone back to the point where this lawsuit started, virtual schools were possible. They already existed. So there are some ways that we can pay attention to laws like this, because this sort of court ruling would apply to us as well. So if a pagan group in Maine started a pagan school, they could get voucher money, just like any other religion. So watch the voucher rules in your state closely. For the most part, I'm a fan of public schools. I think all of us need an education and all of us need a decent education. And I don't think that how much money a family makes should change whether or not they can get that education. Frankly, having that baseline education matters in terms of public discourse and being able to function as a society, right? But the truth of the matter is that at least here in the US, what school you go to is mostly dependent on what zip code you live in. Zip code is highly, highly tied to income level, and zip code is highly tied to educational outcome. So it kind of doesn't matter too much because the system is already biased in that way. But every person needs to have had a baseline level of education. You have to be able to read so that you can vote. You have to be able to do basic math so that you can figure out how to budget for your household. And those sorts of things are things everybody needs. So one of the other cases that came up recently, and it's ongoing, is that in Oklahoma, a Catholic organization filed to create a virtual Catholic charter school. Now, if you're listening from someplace other than the US, or you have a state that isn't really big on charter schools, let's back up a step and understand what a charter school is. In the US, physical space is divided up into school districts, and each school district is responsible for educating students in their district. Every student of a certain age, regardless of disability, is eligible to attend that school unless they've been expelled or something like that. And even then, even if your kid is expelled, they have to provide a way for your kid to get an education, right? So the public schools here are basically the school of last resort in some respects. Here in Michigan, there are very few schools that take special ed kids. And so my kids are pretty much only going to be able to go to a public school if they went back to school. We've homeschooled for about 3.5, almost 4 years now. And our reasons for that are different than most people's, so that's fine. I don't think it's really important to get into our reasons right at this point, but I do think it's important to realize that choice, when we talk about school choice doesn't always apply to everybody, all right? Our choice is public school or homeschool. That's the only options we have. So there are private schools where families pay tuition. Sometimes there are scholarships, sometimes there are grants or whatever, but families are responsible for paying for their students to go to those schools. Most parochial schools, by which I mean schools run by a religious organization, are private schools, but they are usually cheaper than sort of the non-affiliated private school. And part of that is that the religious organization they are tied to, the church or the mosque or the temple or whatever, usually subsidizes the cost of that program. They are doing it as a service to their members and their community. And that's usually how those operate. Catholics and Lutherans run some of the biggest, and Baptists run the biggest sort of school networks other than public schools in the US. Charter schools were originally supposed to be this sort of in-between thing. Most charter schools are run by private organizations, but they operate as a public school that gets public school money. This is the other thing about American schools that you have to understand. The government provides a certain amount of funding per student, and in a lot of cases that's funded by property taxes in the school district. So again, economics is built into the system. If you send your kids to a private or a parochial school, the money that would have been spent on them at your public school does not follow them. It stays within the system that funds the public schools. So, charter schools were supposed to be this in-between thing. They were going to save money and have better outcomes by using market forces to create a school system that was funded by public school money, but not tied to public school rules. Some of the charters out there are really cool. They're focused around a foreign language, or they're focused around some specific type of education, sort of like a magnet school, or they're built around certain principles, or whatever. But they're still public schools, and they still have to follow public school rules. Now, I say that, but at least here in Michigan, most charter schools do not offer special ed services. If they do, they are only sort of what I would call baseline services, right? Resource room type services, services for dyslexia and other reading disorders, services for math disorders, maybe a speech therapist, maybe an occupational therapist. They do not run a full-blown special education department. I don't know of any of them that run special education specific classrooms. In fact, in a number of schools here, to sign up for a charter school, families are expected to sign a waiver that says they have waived all of their rights to a special ed services. That if they wanted those services, they should have stayed in the public school. And so for kids like mine, that's clearly not going to work. They would never let students in who were autistic and needed a lot of support, kids who are cognitively impaired, kids with severe emotional disorders, kids who need a lot of medical care. So these schools, at least here, are already sort of segregating people out. Charter schools are sort of a hot button topic in some places because they don't have to follow the rules that regular schools do. Public schools require certified teachers. Not every charter school does. Public schools have to meet certain curriculum requirements. Charter schools typically don't. And so it's an interesting way. It's played out differently in every state, but it's really interesting to sort of watch what's happened with that. So in this case in Oklahoma, a charter school application was filled out by a college organization, or by a Catholic organization. And they basically said, look, there are tons of rural areas in Oklahoma where there are not enough students to support a Catholic school at a local church. So we want to create this virtual Catholic charter school, and churches could have learning pods, small groups of children that belong to their church, come to their church and learn under the supervision of one adult. So that adult wouldn't have to provide all of the school services because they would be provided through the charter school. Now, why they decided to make this a charter school is unclear to me. They said, well, we're not going to discriminate against people based on religion. And that's true. Catholic schools don't. They do require students to go to chapel, and they do require students to learn religion. But their first application got a lot of media attention. It was rejected, but it's my understanding that most charter school applications in Oklahoma are rejected on the first try. They give feedback on why they reject your application, and you're allowed to go back and edit your application and try again. And on the second try, it appears that they were successful, although the ACLU is now suing them. The Catholic Church in this case is basically saying there's all these cases out there about how you can't withhold money from a public organization that's doing something else just because it's a religious organization, like the issue in Maine. You can't tell people they can't use their voucher at a private school that happens to be religious. So can you tell a charter school that they can't, can you tell someone they can't start a charter school just because they are a religious organization? I keep waiting for somebody to go file a pagan school or a satanic temple school or something, because that would put an end to this discussion pretty quick, I suspect. Among the cases that they cite in their cases are one out of Missouri from, I don't know, what is it, 6 or 7 years ago maybe, where a church has a preschool. The preschool has a playground. The state had a program to help schools upgrade playgrounds. The preschool applied, and they were denied because they were a Christian preschool. In Missouri, where I used to live, there's a constitutional amendment that says you cannot provide financial assistance directly to a church. And their argument was, we met all the other requirements. We would have gotten a grant if we were a separate organization renting from the church that wasn't strictly religious. We would have gotten a grant if we weren't run by a church. And so this lawsuit kind of goes into a funny direction. It talks about how some things should be covered that are, generic. Things like playground upgrade grants. Things like fire suppression systems. Right? If there's a program to upgrade fire suppression systems in schools, and you're going to discriminate against church-based schools over it, what's your reasoning for not picking the church other than it being a church? Don't you want all students to be safe in their schools? So it's not really clear to me where this is all going, but with our current, more conservative Supreme Court, I think a lot more of these kinds of cases are going to come up, and we have to be prepared to figure out what to do with that. How can we make that work for us? The Satanic Temple has certainly found some ways to make things like that work for them, right? One of their big things is the After School Satan Club, which is named as such, I think, largely as a publicity stunt. Their After School Club works on science and scientific exploration of questions and that sort of thing. And it's entirely secular. They only start After School Satan Clubs at schools that have a religious club like Fellowship of Christian Athletes, or a quote-unquote good news club that is basically a Sunday school that runs after school at a school. Because the deal is they have to give the same access. If they're giving access to one religion, they have to give the same access to another religion. If they're giving access to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, they have to give access to Spiral Scouts. If they're giving release time programs where kids can leave school and go to a church nearby or some trailer in the parking lot or whatever to go to a Sunday school class in the middle of the school day, they have to allow it for any religion. And usually when you get to that, okay, well, you have to allow it for any religion, and there's some non-Christian religion that asks, suddenly they decide it's not so important. So I'm not sure whether to be on the side of, I hope that we go and have a bunch of groups set up events like this and groups like this just to watch everybody squirm, or whether we should be making use of it for our own needs and our own purposes. It's spreading to all of these sorts of things keep coming up in new places. Why don't we take a break, and we'll continue this discussion when we come back. Did you know that you can support the Pagan Parenting Podcast? It's really easy. Just go to paganparentingpodcast.com and click on the support link. You can donate directly to support this podcast. If you like what you hear, we'd love to have your support. We're also always interested in advertisers, both here and on our websites. We can advertise for your business here on the podcast, on Spiral Moon TV, Pagan Public Radio, Semaphore News broadcasts, and at our events. Contact me directly, publishing@spiralmoon.net. Welcome back. So let's keep talking about things that have come up in the courts lately around schools and on the news. Schools and religion. So one of the things that has come up this just recently is this idea of school chaplains. Several states have proposed creating school chaplain programs in public schools. Now, their theory is there are mental health problems across the country, particularly among secondary school students, middle school and high school, and we don't have enough school counselors. And we don't have the budget to pay for more, which that's a problem we could fix, right? We could change the way we fund schools. We could fund school nurses and school social workers and school counselors and so on and so forth. But that's not how it works in the U.S. We argue about whether or not we should feed children lunch. These chaplain programs intend to have volunteer chaplains apply to work at schools so that they can support mental health. Now, there's a couple things here. Number one, chaplains are generally supposed to be able to manage any sort of religious discussion with, at least some common sense. In practice, what I've seen is that's true about half of the time. Half of the chaplains really are doing their work in prisons and hospitals and various other places as somebody who is living their faith by being a supportive listener. The other half are there to try and convert people to their faith. We have spent hundreds and hundreds of nights in the hospital over the years. I quit counting somewhere around 800. And we've had some chaplains who were super awesome and super helpful and just the nicest people. And we've had some chaplains who have shown up at, 7 or 8 at night, the day after surgery, while people are still on substantial heavy narcotics, trying to have a discussion about conversion. So we've sort of run the gamut. Just recently, we've started talking to some people here about prison chaplains. We had a prisoner reach out who was in a county jail for a longer term sentence, who could not get any materials because the chaplain who worked at his prison told him that he had to have a house of worship contact them about providing materials for him. It turns out that in Michigan, more than half of the county jails are staffed by a specific evangelical chaplain organization. And those folks get to decide what stuff comes into the jail in terms of religion and spirituality. It was a really complicated discussion with them. So there's this whole setup of, number one, shouldn't we just fund this and pay actual mental health professionals? Because number two, chaplains have some information about mental health, but are not licensed counselors. They're not licensed therapists. They are not licensed social workers. They're ministers. They're priests. They're priestesses. They're nuns, right? So we're going to ask folks to volunteer to come deal with this major crisis that we haven't figured out how to solve. Now, theoretically, it could work, I guess. But like in Texas, they tried to add a provision to prevent chaplains from proselytizing to students, and that was thrown out of their bill. They attempted to require parental consent to have a chaplain speak with your child, and that was thrown out of the bill. They attempted to require school chaplains to have some sort of accreditation, and that was thrown out because they basically said, well, school districts can decide what rules they need. And clearly, the folks doing this are thinking that it's going to be Christian ministers because they can't envision anybody else volunteering. Christians are, in their minds, the only ones who volunteer to do good work like this, who are going to go in and influence children in their beliefs. Now, in one state, I think it was Oklahoma again, somebody showed up from the Temple of Satan. It might have been Florida. The Satanic Temple, I mean. One of the states that's doing this, somebody showed up from the Satanic Temple to the court, to the hearings about the potential bill. And they basically said sort of the same thing I've said before in this episode. I support public schools. I don't think this is a great idea. But hey, if you're going to do it, I'm all in. Satanic Temple was all ready to have a bunch of people apply to be chaplains. Because then the next question would be, well, if you don't pick them to be chaplains, why not? What's the criteria? Does your criteria bias who you're going to pick? Of course, it probably does. So it's not really clear to me how that's going to go. In fact, a bunch of chaplains are against this because the chaplains are like, no, you need actual public safety in schools. You need actual counselors in schools. Chaplains are not those things. And the fact that they would put somebody like that with children without a clear understanding of what those families believe versus what that chaplain believes is a little bit sketchy as far as I'm concerned. I think our household is sort of shielded from that because we live in a really diverse area. Within like 5 miles, there are Jewish synagogues, there's a mosque, although our city did get sued over the mosque location and opening because they didn't want a mosque here. There's a Sikh temple, there's a Hindu temple, there are numerous types of Christians, there is a Buddhist center just down the road. So we sort of live in this sea of diversity in terms of people and cultures and religions. But the town I grew up in was not like that, right? I grew up in a small town in Missouri. 80% of the people there were either German Catholic or German Lutheran. The two churches were literally across the railroad tracks from each other, which gives a whole new meaning to the statement of somebody living on the wrong side of the tracks. The Baptists and the Methodists were those weirdos who built their churches out on the edge of town, by which they meant 50 years ago, where the edge of town was. Those two churches were built, and they are still there, and it is not the edge of town anymore, and they are pretty mainstream. And so I can see how this would have played out in that place versus in the place I live now. Frankly, a couple of years ago when we were back for my dad's funeral, I ended up talking to the minister at his church who was more conservative than the ministers that were there when I was a kid. And he was a little bit distressed that we had masks on in the midst of a COVID flare, and my dad had just died of COVID. Their school, which we did not attend as kids because my parents were of the opinion their academics were not sufficient, and knowing what I know as an adult, I kind of side with them. I have a cousin who came to high school and realized he was 3 years behind in math because algebra didn't exist in their parochial school. This is the kind of guy who they have a school there at the church, and the school there never shut down. They had no virtual school days. They had never asked students to wear masks. Those were all crazy talk, and God would protect them. So, those sorts of schools and school environments exist. They are real. They are not some imagined thing that isn't out there. And so I think we have to be careful and we have to be cautious about what sorts of laws come into play, but also in terms of what use we make of them. We are always guaranteed the right to the same access. Proving that we deserve the same access sometimes takes money that we may not have. But I think there are going to have to be more cases like that come up here in the near future. Because otherwise, schools are maybe not going to be safe for kids who aren't Christian. We see that already in some states where the amount of bullying that goes on of queer kids is a problem. The amount of you can't be a teacher if you have these beliefs has become a thing. A recent New York State Senate candidate, outed a Wiccan priestess by stealing photos from her Facebook and posting them. Basically saying she's a teacher in our schools and I don't believe anybody who's not Christian should be a teacher because Christianity is the only thing that should be taught. and he meant public schools. So these are the people who are out there. These are the people who are making laws about our schools. And our children will only be safe if we are paying attention. Our children need us to be on the watch for these sorts of things, because this is not made up, right? Back in the 90s and the early 2000s, we were worried about people handing out Bibles at school. And instead, now we're talking about whether or not a pagan can be a teacher. We're discussing whether or not Christian churches can open public schools. We're discussing giving public money to churches to educate children for a variety of reasons, some of which are legitimate reasons. But that doesn't just apply to us. To them, it applies to us too. So I think it's really worth watching where these things are going and paying attention to what's going on in your school district. Even if you don't have kids, even if your kids have outgrown the school, even if you homeschool, you need to know what's going on, and you need to pay attention to these things. Because these are the sorts of things that infringe on our rights to the practice of our religions. And they will spill over into other places and other things if that's what becomes normal. So I think that's about it for my review of the news and schools and how that is all affecting us religious-wise. Thanks for joining. That's it for this episode. This is just a reminder that you can find Pagan Parenting Podcast on Facebook. And you can check out our website, paganparentingpodcast.com, for links to all of the podcast sites that we're on and to our support link. The Pagan Parenting Podcast is a production of the Spiral Moon Media Group for Spiral Moon Family Circle. You can find out more at spiralmoon.org. We'll talk more soon.